world is burning, and that's not a metaphor. Smoke from Canadian megafires is literally choking the skies over Europe. Oceans are hitting terrifying new temperature records month after month. We sit in our homes, scrolling through glowing screens while a deep sense of anxiety settles over an entire generation. We see the chaos, we feel the disconnect, and we know something is deeply wrong. But what if I told you a warning about all of this was delivered 3 decades ago, not by a psychic, not in some ancient text, but by, well, something, to a group of 62 children? What happened on a sunny morning in 1994 wasn't just a UFO sighting. It was a message, a vision of humanity's potential collapse, a warning that today feels eerily familiar. It's September the 16th, 1994. It's a bright, clear Friday morning at the Ariel School in Ruwa, a small community just outside Zimbabwe's capital. Ariel was a private multiracial school, and at 10:15 a.m., the bell rang for morning recess. 62 students from 6 to 12 years old poured out onto the sun-drenched playground. Inside, the school's teachers were in a staff meeting. No adult eyes were on the playground, except for a parent helping out at the tuck shop, busy selling snacks. For about 15 minutes, the kids who had the world to themselves, they were playing, chasing each other, just a perfectly normal Friday recess, until it wasn't. Without warning, that ordinary world shattered. A flash of silver in the sky. It wasn't a plane. There was no engine noise. Several disc-shaped objects were hovering silently above the brushland just beyond the school grounds. Then, one of the larger craft started to descend. It wobbled slightly before settling down in a clearing. The children stopped dead in their tracks. The playground went quiet. Some of the younger kids froze, pointing. Some of the older, more curious ones started running towards the fence to get a better look. The craft was smooth and metallic, glinting in the morning sun. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen, and what happened in the next 15 minutes would not only become one of the most remarkable close encounters of the 1990s, but would also deliver a message that would resonate 30 years later. A figure emerged from the top of the main craft, and then another, small, 3 or 4 feet tall, with slender bodies in tight black suits, long black hair, pale, almost featureless faces except for their eyes. Across dozens of separate interviews conducted before the kids could sync up their stories, the description of the eyes is staggering. They were enormous, huge, black, almond-shaped voids. One witness would later say, they definitely didn't look human. The beings moved with an odd slow-motion grace, like running underwater. Some witnesses said they seemed to float, hopping and mimicking the children's movements before suddenly appearing much closer. The entire encounter lasted for about 15 intense minutes. The air itself felt charged. Some kids actually heard a high-pitched flute-like noise, while others described a persistent buzzing sound. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the beings returned to the craft, which silently ascended and shot out of sight. Some children screamed and ran. Others stayed at the fence, paralyzed. Later, when asked why, many struggled to explain. They were terrified, but something kept them rooted. Some said their legs couldn't move, others felt compelled to watch as if the beings wanted them to stay. One girl described it like a dream where you know you should run, but you just can't. And here's where it gets really hard to just brush off. Children on opposite sides of the playground who couldn't have seen or heard each other gave nearly identical descriptions. The same silver discs, the same small beings with terrifying black eyes. They weren't just telling a story, they were recounting a shared experience. But the most disturbing part wasn't what they saw, it was what the beings did next. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Several of the older students who stayed at the edge of the playground reported that one of the beings stared directly at them. One of those students was Emily Trim. Now, she was playing a game with a friend on the boundary logs of the property when she heard a high-pitched frequency. She said she saw a flash, and then the craft. And she described how 2 of the beings hopped around the site, curious, before suddenly being at an arm's reach away from Emily. In that instant, she and the other children were completely frozen. It wasn't spoken language. It was a torrent of visions. It was a communication through the eyes. Emma later recounted all of this in an interview. This wasn't a gentle, dreamlike experience. The children described a powerful physical sensation, an overwhelming feeling of despair and hopelessness that washed over them as the images filled their minds. It was as if their own consciousness was hijacked. One boy described looking into the alien's eyes and feeling like he was in a tunnel where nothing else in the world existed. He was locked in and could only break the gaze and run when the being looked away. For the others, the flood of information was so intense it caused a pressure in their head, a feeling of being overwhelmed by pure, raw data and emotion that they just couldn't process. The visions themselves, while centered on a core theme, had variations. Emily Trim's experience was one of the most detailed. She stated, "The girl she was playing with received messages about the environment, while her communication focused more on technology. The being showed her visions of technology being used incorrectly, a warning that our own advancements could become our own downfall if not handled with care and wisdom. Other children received more explicitly environmental warnings. They saw visions of a world in distress, forests being cut down, rivers choked with black pollution, and the air becoming unbreathable. One girl recalled the powerful non-verbal impression that we were harming the planet, while another was told the world would end because they are not taking care of the planet. Then, as suddenly as it began, the transmission stopped. The beings vanished. The silence on the playground was shattered by a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. The psychic weight was lifted and the children's minds crashed back to reality. Confusion turned instantly to terror, and younger children began to scream and cry uncontrollably. The older ones, grappling with the horrifying images they just witnessed, were visibly shaken and panicked. They weren't just scared of a strange sight, they were traumatized by a message they couldn't fully comprehend, but felt with every fiber of their being. They had seen a terrible future, and now they had to live with it. When the beings vanished, the children ran screaming to the teachers. The staff dismissed it as just a game that's gone completely wild. But when parents heard the same panic stories, the school was flooded with calls. Now, Cynthia Hind, who was a respected UFO investigator, arrived 4 days later. She had the children draw what they saw. The drawings were startlingly similar. Classic saucer-shaped crafts and small figures with massive eyes. Then came Dr. John E. Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard psychiatrist who specialized in child trauma and adolescent psychology. When he heard about 60 simultaneous witnesses, he instantly flew to Zimbabwe. 2 months later, Mack interviewed the children one-on-one, using non-leading questions. He observed their body language, their emotional state, the unwavering conviction in their voices. These weren't kids performing for attention. They were genuinely disturbed, reliving a terrifying experience. His conclusion was stunning. They were telling the truth. A Harvard psychiatrist had put his credibility on the line. That conclusion came at a steep price. When Mack published his findings and publicly defended the children's accounts, the backlash from academic establishments was swift and brutal. Harvard launched an unprecedented 14-month investigation into his work. First time in the university's history, a tenured professor faced such scrutiny for their research conclusions. Colleagues, who had respected him for decades, suddenly questioned his sanity. His Pulitzer Prize couldn't shield him from accusations that he'd gone off the deep end. But Mack never wavered. He'd spent his career studying trauma, and he knew what he was seeing in those children's eyes. It wasn't delusion. It was the aftermath of something real. The encounter lasted 15 minutes. Its shadow stretched for decades. The children were met with confusion and dismissal. And when their story hit the news, they became the UFO kids, ridiculed and bullied by peers who hadn't seen the craft. Being one of 62 witnesses provided some safety in numbers, but it didn't erase the feeling of being ostracized. For 30 years, they carried this burden, the weight of knowing something profound and watching the world ignore them. Emily Trim, one of the key witnesses, became an artist. Her work was a direct manifestation of the messages she received, a way to process the warning that she carried for a lifetime, basically. It wasn't a memory, it was this defining traumatic event that shaped their understanding of the world. Of course, a story this wild needs a reality check, right? The most common explanation, mass hysteria. Could fear have spread like a virus, creating a shared delusion? Others point to a Russian rocket re-entry 2 days prior, or suggest Dr. Mack led the children to the environmental message during interviews 2 months later. But these explanations are problems. Mass hysteria doesn't explain the specific, consistent details from children. They were all interviewed separately, and details documented by school staff and Cynthia Hind before Mack arrived. A rocket re-entry doesn't explain a craft landing with beings emerging in broad daylight either. Most importantly, the children's raw trauma in interview footage is hard to fake. While some details varied, some kids interpreted the beings as tikoloshes, from local folklore. The core narrative remained unshakable: a landing, strange beings, and a powerful warning. The easy explanations just don't fit. 62 children, interviewed separately, described the same beings, the same craft, the same message. Dr. Mack risked his career to validate their accounts. 30 years later, they still stand by what they saw. At some point, the simplest explanation isn't mass hysteria, it's that something real happened. And now we're living in the world they were actually trying to warn us about. 30 years later, the children of Ariel School are now adults. Emily Trim, now an artist, said watching the news in 2025 is like watching the nightmare we tried to warn everyone about. Another witness described it as carrying a secret nobody wanted to hear, and now it's too late. They tried to tell us, we just didn't listen. The children saw forests burning, rivers choked with pollution, a world in distress. 2024 was the planet's warmest year on record, 2.63 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial average. In 2023, Canada's wildfire smoke stretched across the Atlantic, darkening skies in Europe. Ocean temperatures hit record highs month after month. The Amazon rainforest now releases more CO2 than it absorbs. The visions aren't a distant future, they're our present reality. Emily Trim received warnings about technology becoming our downfall if not handled with wisdom. Today, AI-driven algorithms hijack our attention. Apps like TikTok activate the same brain regions as gambling addiction. In early 2000s, people shifted focus on a device every 2.5 minutes. By 2023, that dropped to 47 seconds. We're not using technology, it's using us. We carry supercomputers in our pockets, but we've never been more distracted, anxious, or unable to focus on what matters. The environmental and the technological warnings converge into something darker, though. The beings warned about humanity losing its connection to itself, each other, and the planet. Between 2009 and 2021, high school students reported persistent sadness or hopelessness actually increased from 26% to 42%. Teen suicide rates climbed 62% since 2007. Gen Z reports the highest loneliness levels of any generation, despite being the most connected digitally. We're scrolling through curated lives while our mental health crumbles, watching the planet burn while feeling powerless to stop it. The beings showed a future where humanity had disconnected from what makes us human: empathy, community, purpose. 30 years later, we're living it. These three pillars aren't separate. They're a feedback loop. Climate anxiety fuels our escape into screens. Screen addiction destroys our ability to process complex problems. Our disconnection makes us incapable of collective action. Emily Trim said it best. We were just kids. We didn't understand what we were being shown. But now, as adults, we understand perfectly. And it's absolutely terrifying. The children of Ariel School tried to warn us. They carried the burden of a message they barely understood, delivered by beings we can't explain. They were ridiculed, dismissed, and ignored. And now, 30 years later, we're watching their nightmare unfold in real time. The question isn't whether they were telling the truth anymore. The question is, are we finally ready to listen? So what are we left with? 62 witnesses, remarkable consistency in their core testimony, an investigation by a top Harvard psychiatrist who concluded the children's experience was genuine, and at the heart of it, a frighteningly relevant warning about environmental irresponsibility and technological addiction that is playing out right before our eyes. Why choose children, the most powerless members of society, to deliver such a heavy message? Maybe because they knew the adults just wouldn't listen. Maybe the message wasn't for the adults of 1994. Maybe it was for us right now in 2025. On September the 16th, 1994, a group of kids tried to sound an alarm. Today, we are living inside that alarm. The question isn't whether their story was real anymore. The drawings are too similar, the testimony too consistent to simply dismiss. The real question is, what do we do with the warning? Here's the thing those beings understood that we are only now learning. Awareness is the first step. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. So if this video made you feel uncomfortable, good. That discomfort means you're paying attention. The beings didn't show those children the future to paralyze them. They showed them to warn them. And warnings only work if someone listens. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Don't let this message die in obscurity. Share the story. Share this video. Not because I want views, but because 62 people spent 30 years carrying a burden nobody wanted to hear. the least we can do is make sure their warning reaches the people who need to hear it. Now, if you're new here, welcome to Fireside Mysteries. This is where we dig into the stories that make you question everything. UFOs, cryptids, conspiracies, and the truths hiding in plain sight. If this video did make you think, hit subscribe. I'm trying to build a community of people who aren't afraid to look at the uncomfortable questions. And here's my question for you. If those beings appeared to you today in 2025, what warning do you think they give? Climate? AI? Something we haven't even thought of yet? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and the best responses might actually shape a future video.